Hello, sir. May I help you? Those 5 simple words, spoken with trembling hands in the language of silence, would change everything. In the gleaming marble lobby of Reynolds Media Corporation, a shy girl named Milan was about to discover that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the loudest echoes. This heartwarming encounter would prove that the most inspirational moments happen when we least expect them, and the person who needed to witness it most was standing in the shadows, watching every gesture. 24-year-old Milan Collins pressed herself against the lobby's far wall, clutching her intern badge like a shield. This shy girl had perfected the art of invisibility in this glass tower where ambition echoed louder than empathy. For 3 months, she'd navigated the marketing department's ruthless energy, learning that quiet kindness was often mistaken for weakness, especially by colleagues like Elodie, whose sharp tongue cut down anyone she perceived as competition. The receptionist's frustrated voice pierced the morning calm. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." A distinguished man in his 30s stood before the marble desk, his hands moving in elegant, desperate gestures. His eyes held the patient sadness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. Milan's heart clenched. She recognized that look, the same resigned disappointment she'd seen in her younger brother Danny's eyes countless times. The same helpless frustration that had driven her to learn sign language at 13, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor with online videos, until her fingers could speak what her voice couldn't always convey. Love. Understanding. You matter. Her hands tingled with the familiar urge to help, but doubt crept in like ice water. This wasn't her place. She was nobody, just an intern who brought coffee and made copies. Yet watching this man's shoulders slump with each failed attempt at communication felt like watching Danny all over again, small and unheard in a world too busy to listen. Taking a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff, Milan moved forward. Her hands lifted fingers, shaping words with fluid grace. "Hello, sir. May I help you?" The man's face transformed, lighting up like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," he signed back. "I thought no one here would understand me." The entire lobby fell silent, stunned by this unexpected display of compassion and competence. But Milan didn't see the figure who had just emerged from the executive elevator, didn't notice the piercing gaze of Lawrence Reynolds, CEO of the very empire surrounding them, as he witnessed something he thought no longer existed in the corporate world. What hidden pain was this powerful man carrying? And how would Milan's simple act of kindness crack open wounds he'd spent years sealing shut? Milan's conversation with Mark continued, her hands moving with increasing confidence as she learned he was an art entrepreneur seeking partnership for a community accessibility project. But her moment of triumph was about to be shattered by the very forces she'd hoped to avoid. "Well, well," came Elodie's sharp voice, cutting through the lobby like a blade. "Look who's decided to play translator. An intern like you showing off. Don't think a few hand gestures will get you noticed." Milan's face flushed crimson as heads turned their way. Elodie's public humiliation was a calculated strike designed to reduce Milan's moment of connection to mere attention-seeking behavior. "I was just helping," Milan began, but Elodie's cruel smile stopped her cold. "Helping or overstepping boundaries that exist for good reasons. We have professional interpreters for actual client communications. This isn't some charity case for you to practice on." Mark's expression darkened as he read the hostile body language even without hearing Elodie's words. Milan's hands trembled as she interpreted the exchange, softening Elodie's cruelty, even as her own confidence crumbled. From his vantage point near the elevators, Lawrence observed the dynamics with laser focus. He'd built his empire by reading people, by understanding the subtle power plays that determined who rose and who fell. What he saw now was achingly familiar talent being crushed by those who confused volume with value. The marketing manager approached, drawn by the commotion. "Milan, I need to speak with you about interfering in matters above your role. Client relations require proper protocols." Milan felt the familiar urge to disappear, to become small and invisible again. She nodded mutely, her brief moment of visibility already transforming into public shame. As the crowd began to disperse, she caught Mr. Parker's gentle gaze from his security post. The elderly guard had been watching the entire exchange with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature. Once an art teacher before budget cuts forced him into security work, he possessed an uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only problems. "Miss Milan," he called softly as she passed his desk, his voice carrying the warmth of 1,000 classroom encouragements. "Don't be afraid of doing what's right. That man saw you, and so did I." His words followed her to the elevator, where she rode in silence to the marketing floor, certain her brief moment of courage had cost her more than she could afford. But what Milan didn't know was that Lawrence Reynolds had made a decision that would change everything. "Send Milan Collins to my office," he told his assistant, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Now." 20 minutes later, Milan sat across from the most powerful man in the building, her hands folded in her lap, like a schoolchild awaiting punishment. Lawrence's office was a monument to success, floor-to-ceiling windows, prestigious awards, photographs of corporate victories. But it was strangely devoid of personal touches, as if the man who worked here had systematically removed every trace of humanity from his environment. "Why do you know sign language?" Lawrence asked without preamble, his steel-gray eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Milan's voice barely rose above a whisper. "My brother is deaf. I learned so I could talk to him." Lawrence leaned back, something flickering behind his controlled expression. The silence stretched between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed, heavy with unspoken understanding. "Tell me about him," Lawrence said, and Milan heard something unexpected in his voice, not the corporate authority she'd braced for, but something softer, more vulnerable. "Danny is 16, she began, her voice growing stronger as love overcame fear. "He was born deaf, and for years our family struggled with communication. I started learning sign language when I was 8, because I couldn't bear watching him feel left out of conversations, isolated in his own home." Lawrence's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a barely perceptible softening that suggested her words had found their mark. This shy girl had no idea that her simple story was touching something deep within the hardened executive. "Your dedication to your brother is remarkable," Lawrence said finally. "That kind of commitment to family speaks to character." Milan sensed there was more beneath his words, layers of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. But she also felt something unexpected. This conversation wasn't the reprimand she'd feared. Instead, it felt like an assessment, as if Lawrence was measuring something in her that went beyond job performance. "From now on," Lawrence continued, his voice carrying new weight, "I'll be observing your work more closely. Not as punishment, but as evaluation." Milan left that meeting with her head spinning, unsure whether she'd been warned or encouraged. But she did notice something changing in the days that followed. Lawrence would appear at marketing meetings, his presence commanding attention, while his gaze often found her studying her interactions, her problem-solving, her natural empathy. Meanwhile, Elodie's jealousy was growing into something dangerous. She began spreading whispers about favoritism, about unqualified interns getting special treatment. Her schemes to edge Milan out of projects became increasingly bold, as if she sensed that time was running out to eliminate this unexpected threat to her own ambitions. How could Milan have known that her greatest test was still coming, and that failure would threaten not just her job, but her faith in the very kindness that defined her? The test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, during the most important presentation of the quarter, disaster struck in the most public way possible. Mark had returned for a formal meeting with the marketing team, and the professional interpreter was caught in traffic running dangerously late. "We can't postpone," Lawrence announced, his voice carrying the weight of corporate deadlines and million-dollar decisions. "The marketing team will need to handle communications until our interpreter arrives." Elodie seized her moment like a predator sensing weakness. "Milan, she's just an intern. She'll ruin it. This is too important for amateur hour." But Lawrence's gaze found Milan across the conference room. "Milan, you're up." The words hit her like lightning. Every eye in the room turned toward her, measuring, judging, waiting for her to fail. Milan's legs felt like water as she stood, her hands already beginning to tremble with the weight of expectation. Mark smiled encouragingly, but Milan could barely see him through the fog of her own panic. This wasn't a quiet conversation in a lobby. This was a formal presentation with department heads, profit margins, and her entire future hanging in the balance. She began to sign, but her nerves overwhelmed her immediately. Her hands shook, making her usually fluid gestures awkward and uncertain. She stumbled over technical terms, mixed up simple phrases, and watched in horror as confusion flickered across Mark's face. Muffled laughter rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "I told you so." Elodie's smirk was visible in Milan's peripheral vision, a silent victory dance that said everything about how this moment would be remembered. "I'm sorry," Milan whispered, her voice cracking. "I need a moment." She fled to the women's restroom, tears streaming down her face as the familiar walls of her old sanctuary welcomed her back. This was where she belonged, hidden, small, invisible. How had she ever thought she could be anything more? The door opened softly, and familiar footsteps approached. Mr. Parker's gentle voice called through the stall door. "Miss Milan, I brought you something." She opened the door to find the elderly security guard holding a clean handkerchief, his weathered face full of grandfatherly concern. "No one gets it right the first time," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent encouraging young people through their darkest moments. "The person who truly saw you today was you. You saw someone who needed help and you stepped forward. That's not failure, that's courage." His words wrapped around her like armor, but Milan wasn't sure she had the strength to try again. What if I'm not good enough? What if Elodie's right, and I'm just fooling myself? Mr. Parker's eyes twinkled with the kind of knowledge that comes from watching countless students discover their own potential. "Miss Milan, I taught art for 37 years. You know what I learned. The students who worried most about being good enough were always the ones who cared the most. And caring, that's where real talent begins." What happened next was nothing short of inspirational. When Milan returned to the conference room, the professional interpreter had arrived and taken over. But something remarkable occurred that no one had anticipated. Mark was watching her with intense interest. Lawrence was taking notes with unusual focus, and even Elodie seemed uncertain about her earlier triumph. The energy in the room had shifted completely. "Milan?" Mark said, his hands moving with deliberate clarity as the professional interpreter translated. "I'd like to request you specifically for tomorrow's private meeting. Just us." The room went silent. In 20 years of business, Mark had never made such a specific personnel request. The professional interpreter looked stunned. Elodie's face went pale, "Are you certain?" Lawrence asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mark's response was immediate and unwavering. "I've worked with many interpreters. Most translate words perfectly. But Milan translates something more important. She translates intention and emotion. That's what this project needs." Milan felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This man, this successful entrepreneur whose opinion carried weight, was choosing her not despite her vulnerability, but because of the humanity she brought to every interaction. Lawrence's expression revealed nothing, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was processing something significant. "Tomorrow, then," he said finally. "Milan, my office first. We need to discuss your expanded responsibilities." As the meeting concluded, Milan realized something profound had happened. Her failure hadn't ended her story. It had somehow become the very thing that proved her worth. The heartwarming truth was that authenticity mattered more than perfection. But she also sensed that Lawrence's interest in her went deeper than professional competence, and that tomorrow's conversation would reveal truths that would change everything she thought she knew about her place in this corporate world. What secrets was Lawrence hiding, and how would tomorrow's private meeting with Mark transform not just Milan's career, but her understanding of what it truly means to be seen and valued? The next morning, Milan found herself in Lawrence's office before sunrise. Her hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Something had shifted overnight. The crushing anxiety had transformed into quiet determination, as if Mr. Parker's words had worked some kind of magic on her wounded confidence. "There's something you need to understand about yesterday." Lawrence began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this conversation would venture into territories far beyond corporate protocols. "Mark's request wasn't random. He's been evaluating this company for months, deciding whether we're worthy of partnership." Milan's eyes widened. "Evaluating us?" Yesterday's presentation wasn't just about the project. It was a character assessment. Lawrence continued, his expression growing more serious. "Everyone in that room saw a young woman struggling and chose to judge rather than support. Everyone except you, who chose vulnerability over self-protection." He stood and moved to the windows, his silhouette backlit by the golden morning light. "Mark told me something after you left yesterday. He said watching you fail so publicly, then return with such grace, reminded him why he wanted to work with us in the first place. He believes authentic humanity is rarer than technical perfection." Milan felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "So when he requested me..." "He was making a statement about values over credentials," Lawrence finished. "But there's more." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his corporate mask began to slip. "Your situation reminds me of something I experienced years ago. A corporate betrayal that nearly destroyed my faith in human decency." This was the first glimpse Milan had gotten into Lawrence's past, the first crack in his perfectly controlled facade. She sensed there were deeper wounds here, scars that explained his legendary coldness. The private meeting with Mark later that morning was unlike anything Milan had experienced. In the quiet of Lawrence's smaller conference room, with just the three of them and natural light streaming through tall windows, something magical happened. Milan interpreted with growing confidence. But more than that, she began to see patterns in Mark's communication style, to anticipate his needs, to add subtle emotional context that transformed mere translation into genuine connection. Never be afraid when you already have the language of the heart. Mark signed his hands, moving with the poetry that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime communicating beyond words. As Milan voiced his message, she felt Lawrence's intense gaze on her, studying not just her interpretation, but something deeper: the way she carried herself, the unconscious grace of her movements, the automatic compassion that informed every gesture. Milan. Mark continued his signs, deliberate and clear. I need to tell you something important. This meeting, this project, it's bigger than you realize. What we're planning isn't just about accessibility. It's about creating a model that other companies will follow. Milan's hands moved smoothly, but her mind was racing. The implications were staggering, not just for her career, but for countless people like Danny who had spent their lives navigating a world designed without them in mind. But models require leaders. Mark added, his expression growing serious. People who understand inclusion not as a concept, but as a lived experience. People who have been transformed by caring for others. Lawrence leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What exactly are you proposing, Mark? Mark's response sent shockwaves through the small room. I'm proposing that Milan lead the entire communications initiative, not as an assistant or junior associate, but as director of a new department within Reynolds Media. Milan's hands froze mid-translation. Director, her, the shy girl who had been making copies just weeks ago. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't have the experience, the credentials. You have something better, Mark interrupted gently. You have authenticity. You've lived with the communication barriers we're trying to solve. You understand what inclusion feels like from the inside out. Lawrence was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resonance that suggested this decision meant more to him than corporate strategy. Mark's right, he said, his words precise and deliberate. Technical skills can be taught. But the kind of instinctive empathy you demonstrated in our lobby, that's not something you can train. It's either genuine or it's not. Milan felt tears threatening as the magnitude of the opportunity settled over her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This inspirational moment felt surreal. Everything she'd dreamed of was being offered by two men who saw potential where she'd only seen limitations. But what about Elodie? The other interns, they'll say I don't deserve this, Milan said, voicing her deepest fears. Let them, Lawrence replied, his voice carrying steel wrapped in surprising warmth. Excellence always provokes criticism from mediocrity. The question isn't whether you deserve this opportunity. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it. The heartwarming truth of his words hit her like a revelation. This wasn't about proving herself to critics. It was about stepping into the person she was meant to become. As they prepared to leave the meeting, Mark turned to Milan with one final message: trust the language of your heart. It's been guiding you perfectly so far. Walking out of that room, Milan felt like a completely different person from the invisible intern who had entered. But she also sensed that their moment of triumph was about to face its greatest test. Neither Milan nor Lawrence could have predicted that their breakthrough was about to be challenged in the most public, most brutal way possible, and that Elodie's jealousy had reached dangerous levels that would threaten everything they'd just built. The contract signing ceremony was meant to be a celebration, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Word of Milan's unexpected promotion had spread through the company like wildfire, and the conference room buzzed with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Elodie had positioned herself strategically near the back, her smile sharp as a blade waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She'd spent the week collecting allies, planting seeds of doubt about Milan's qualifications, building a case that favoritism had corrupted what should have been a merit-based decision. As the formal presentations began, Milan stood beside Lawrence and Mark, interpreting for the room while her hands painted meaning in the air. She had found her rhythm now, her confidence built on the solid foundation of purpose, rather than the shifting sands of approval. But just as Mark began his closing remarks, Elodie's voice cut through the proceedings like a knife. "I'm sorry," she said, standing with calculated precision, "but I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Milan's just faking it. She's nothing but lucky, and we're about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract based on amateur theatrics." The room went dead silent. Milan felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, but something had fundamentally changed in her core. Instead of crumbling, she stood straighter, her hands continuing to move with steady grace as she interpreted Elodie's words for Mark. Mark's response was immediate and devastating. He rose to his full height, his presence commanding the room as effectively as any CEO. Through Milan's clear, unwavering interpretation, his words rang out like a bell. "This company doesn't need perfection. It needs people who listen with their hearts. I've worked with dozens of professional interpreters, and most treat communication like a mechanical process. Words in words, out nothing more." Milan's voice trembled slightly as she continued translating, but her hands remained steady. "But Milan doesn't just interpret language, she interprets humanity. When I speak about barriers, she conveys not just my words, but my frustration, my hope, my determination to change things. That's not luck. That's a rare gift that can't be taught or faked." The room erupted in applause, but it was Lawrence's response that sealed Elodie's fate. He stood slowly, his corporate authority filling the space like a thunderstorm. "Milan will lead communications for this initiative," he declared, his voice carrying absolute finality. "And anyone who questions that decision is questioning my judgment and Mark's wisdom." He turned his gaze directly to Elodie, his expression cold as winter morning. "As for unprofessional behavior during client presentations, that will be addressed through proper HR channels." Elodie's face went ashen as she realized her calculated strike had backfired spectacularly. The allies she'd cultivated suddenly found other places to look, and the whispered support she'd counted on evaporated like morning mist. But it was what happened next that truly transformed everything. Lawrence approached Milan as the crowd began to disperse, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You remind me of my daughter," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and new hope. "She once signed to me, 'Dad, trust me.' I didn't listen. I was too busy, too important, too focused on everything except what mattered most." Milan's eyes filled with tears as understanding dawned. "Mr. Reynolds, but today I trust you." He continued, his words carrying the force of a vow. "Not because you're perfect, but because you understand that communication is about connection, not just information." Milan's response came from the deepest part of her heart. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I just don't want anyone left behind." They shared a moment of quiet understanding. Two people who had learned that true strength comes not from power or position, but from the courage to remain open-hearted in a world that often rewards the opposite. As the conference room emptied, Mark approached them both, his hands moving with elegant economy. "What you've built here isn't just a business partnership. It's proof that kindness and competence can coexist, that inclusion makes everyone stronger." This inspirational moment felt like the culmination of everything Milan had worked toward, but she sensed it was also just the beginning of something much larger. The most powerful transformation was still to come, one that would prove that genuine kindness really does come full circle, touching lives in ways that extend far beyond corporate contracts and career advancement. 1 month later, Milan stood in the gleaming headquarters of Reynolds Media, but everything had changed. The accessibility initiative had transformed from a single project into a company-wide revolution, with Milan's new department leading innovations that had caught the attention of businesses nationwide. The shy girl who once pressed herself against lobby walls now commanded respect in boardrooms not through force or manipulation, but through the quiet authority that comes from authentic expertise. Her office, her actual office with her name on the door, overlooked the same lobby where her inspirational journey had begun. From his security desk, Mr. Parker watched Milan pass through the morning crowds, no longer invisible, but radiating the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your work matters. He smiled to himself, whispering words meant for no one but somehow heard by everyone who needed them. Finally, she's seen. The transformation hadn't been limited to Milan. Lawrence had begun incorporating accessibility considerations into every aspect of the company's operations, driven by a renewed sense of purpose that honored both his daughter's memory and his hard-won wisdom about the costs of emotional isolation. The cold corporate machine had developed a heart, and that heartbeat with rhythms of inclusion and understanding. Even more remarkably, Elodie's departure to another company had created space for a different kind of culture to emerge in the marketing department, one where collaboration replaced competition, where different perspectives were valued rather than threatened, where Milan's approach to inclusive communication had become the gold standard. But the real magic happened in the smaller moments. Danny had visited the office twice, his face glowing with pride as he watched his sister lead meetings where sign language was just one of many languages spoken with equal fluency and respect. Their parents, initially skeptical of Milan's career pivot, now bragged to neighbors about their daughter who was changing how businesses think about communication. The project launch event filled the main auditorium to capacity, with attendees representing dozens of disability advocacy groups, business leaders, and community organizations. As Milan took the stage, her hands moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had found her voice and learned to use it powerfully. 6 months ago, she began her words, reaching both hearing and deaf audience members through multiple interpretation methods. I was invisible. Not because I chose to be, but because I believed that was my place. I thought kindness was something you did quietly in corners, without disturbing the important business of the world. Lawrence sat in the front row, watching her command the stage with natural grace. For the first time since losing his daughter, his memories brought joy rather than just pain. A heartwarming reminder that love and loss could coexist, that healing was possible, even after devastating betrayal. But I learned something important, Milan continued. Kindness isn't meant to be invisible. It's meant to be a beacon, a bridge, a bold declaration that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be understood, valued, and included. In the audience, Mark nodded approvingly, his presence a reminder of how far they'd all traveled from that uncertain morning when a shy girl had chosen courage over comfort. As the presentation concluded and applause filled the auditorium, Milan caught sight of a banner hanging at the back of the room, "Kindness always comes full circle." Mark's words from that first day, now the unofficial motto of the Accessibility Initiative. After the crowd dispersed, Lawrence approached Milan backstage, his expression carrying the peace that comes from finding purpose after profound loss. "She would have loved what you've built here," he said, referring to the daughter whose memory had shaped his understanding of what truly mattered. "Every bridge you've created, every barrier you've removed, every person you've helped feels seen. She's been part of that." Milan felt the weight and privilege of carrying forward such a legacy, understanding that she wasn't just holding a position, but a sacred trust, the responsibility to ensure that no one would ever feel as invisible as she once had. The girl who had once hidden in bathroom stalls now stood as living proof that authentic kindness, when combined with courage and competence, could transform not just individuals, but entire systems, One conversation, one connection, one act of recognition at a time. Kindness always comes full circle, and your circle might be exactly what someone is waiting for.